Weston-super-Mare is a seaside town in the west of England. To the north, Worlebury Hill shows signs of habitation in pre-Roman times. To the south, Uphill was a busy local seaport in the 17th and 18th centuries. Weston-super-Mare itself had its main expansion in the latter half of the 19th century. Its economic life came from two sources of revenue: fishing and the tourist trade. In this town lived Rachel Eddington, the grandmother of Arthur Stanley Eddington. Eddington's father, Arthur Henry Eddington, was a school teacher in Kendal when Eddington was born in 1882. But the father died before the boy was 2, and the widowed mother, Sarah, went to live with her mother-in-law. Thus, Arthur Stanley Eddington came to spend his childhood in Weston-super-Mare. The family lived for some years in this house at number 2, Wilton Gardens. Then, in 1893, Sarah Eddington bought one of the houses nearby, Varzin. Here she lived for 21 years, while her children grew up. Then, in 1914, she went to live with her son in Cambridge. We don't know much about her, but this photograph of her playing chess in Varzin with her son shows that she must have been a lady of some intellectual calibre. We can imagine Eddington growing up in Weston and enjoying cycle rides in the surrounding countryside. It was a healthy environment for a growing boy. It is here he received the beginnings of an education that would lead him first to Manchester and then to Cambridge, where he was to do most of his life's work. Here in Weston, 80 years later, we can still trace some of the formative influences that bore on the young Eddington's life and helped to shape his later ideas and actions. Vibert Douglas, his biographer, records that as a young boy he liked to walk on the beach at night and try to count the stars. And at the age of 10, he had observed much of the sky with the aid of a 3-inch telescope, which his headmaster had loaned to him. He went to school at Bryn Melyn, a small fee-paying school for boys. There were never more than 43 boys at the school, which had a full-time staff of just 3 masters. The school brochure emphasized the individual care taken of each boy with regard to health, training and tuition. Bryn Melyn was situated about a mile from Varzin on the hillside to the north of the town. Eddington may well have climbed this path on his way to school each day. Records on file in the local library give us some illuminating glimpses of Eddington's school days at Bryn Melyn. In this report, from his headmaster to his mother, we find Mr. Knight struggling to find some constructive criticisms of his high-flying pupil. Several people have expressed a fear lest Stanley's head should be turned by success or by too much praise. But so far as I can judge, he still keeps his simplicity and betrays no sign of that priggishness which so often makes clever boys unbearable. I cannot say that I've always been perfectly satisfied with his geography lessons. He's never missed a lesson, or, so far as I can remember, got bad marks. But I've sometimes felt a little disappointed at his not doing a shade better, and this has made me fear once or twice that he might be getting perhaps just the least bit careless. Except for this, and this you will see is not much, I'm perfectly satisfied with Stanley in all respects. The school had a literary society, at which the individual boys made presentations of their particular studies. The minutes of this society are still preserved in the Woodspring Central Library. They make a fascinating account of Eddington's early interest in astronomy and show that between the ages of 10 and 16 he became very knowledgeable about this subject, which was to become the basis of his life's work. He became one of the Society's curators of astronomy in 1893, on May the 15th. And on November the 13th he gave his first recorded lecture on astronomy, 6 weeks before his 11th birthday. Stanley Eddington read a very interesting report on astronomy specially mentioning Venus and Jupiter, now very brilliant. In the next 5 years, he gave at least 27 more reports on astronomy. This must have been excellent training for the lecturing that was to be an important feature of his adult life, and probably a medium for many of his original disclosures. He also gave reports on several other subjects, 7 on entomology, 1 on Sir John Franklin, the Arctic explorer, 1 on a Worcestershire village, 1 on Pizarro, and it seems also 1 on Santa Claus, if only we knew what he had to say about that. But of course, the most interesting reports were those on astronomy, because it is here that we can trace the seeds of his later work. Many of the reports deal with the planets and stars currently visible. Evidently, the boys did a lot of star watching, both with the naked eye and with the aid of a telescope. Eddington's acuteness of observation developed so well that in 1897 he reported having seen the planetoid Vesta, the only planetoid visible to the naked eye. It may have been in the fall of 1894 that his interest first turned to the sun. On October the 2nd, he reported an upcoming transit of Mercury across the sun's disk, and in the minutes of November the 18th we can find out what happened. Stanley Eddington read an amusing paper on the recent transit of Mercury, of which he alone among our members was fortunate enough to catch a momentary glimpse. An amusing paper. It seems that Eddington was a shy boy. In fact, there's a story that once at a tea party he was so shy that he hid under the table. And as an adult, he would spend many hours on long solitary bicycle rides, thousands of miles a year. But he was enthusiastic too, and he wanted to communicate his excitement to other people. Perhaps he used his puckish sense of humor to conceal that underlying shyness. But back to the Literary Society. Shortly after the transit of Mercury, Eddington reported that the year 1895 was to be a year of great disturbance in the sun's photosphere. He and the other boys of Bryn Melyn observed a partial eclipse, and he reported on the discovery of helium in the same year in which it was first found on Earth. 24 years later, Eddington was to travel to West Africa to observe another eclipse of the sun and bring back some of the first experimental evidence to confirm Einstein's general theory of relativity. In the Bryn Melyn records for 1897, we find that Eddington reported on the origin of the heat of the sun. This must have been a description of the Helmholtz mechanism of gravitational collapse. Helmholtz himself had died 3 years earlier. So at 14 and a half, Eddington already knew more about gravitation than most people ever know. Not only was it the force that made apples fall and held the planets in orbit, it could also account for the heat of the sun. What else might it do? Later, Eddington was to know that gravitation also bent the path of a beam of light and even warped the structure of space-time itself. The following year, turning from the sun to the stars, Eddington told the Bryn Melyn boys that Arcturus was 6,000 times larger than the sun. Did his simple wonder at this disparity lead later on to his theory of gas globes and stellar constitution? The Bryn Melyn records are full of foreshadowings, some causal and some coincidental. Eddington's last presentation as a student of the school was given in 1898, September the 26th, 3 months before his 16th birthday. He reported that earlier news of the discovery of the second satellite of the Earth was a false alarm. We would say an uncorroborated hypothesis. He reported observations of meteors and of a huge sunspot 36,000 miles in diameter. And looking further afield, he reported sightings of the Ring Nebula in Lara and of the huge nebula in Andromeda. But Mr. H.E. Landon, Eddington's teacher for the previous 2 years, making the final report of the meeting, mentioned Eddington's winning the senior county scholarship, his destination being Owens College, Manchester. Thus Eddington left Bryn Melyn, but he didn't sever his connections. Evidently he retained a bond of gratitude to Mr. Landon, who had taught him especially well. The Woodspring Library preserves 3 letters which Eddington wrote to Mr. Landon in 1899, 1900 and 1901, describing his life in Manchester and his first impressions of Cambridge, where he was to do his life's work. And in 1899, July the 3rd, Eddington returned to Bryn Melyn and gave a last report to the Literary Society. One last time, he described the stars and planets presently visible. He reported another eclipse of the sun. And finally, he described a telescope being shown at the Paris exhibition, a telescope which was said to reflect anything as large as an omnibus on the moon. And that is the last report of Eddington in the minutes of the Bryn Melyn Literary Society. But we have more examples of Eddington's lasting gratitude to Mr. Landon. When he became senior wrangler, the top position in the Cambridge mathematics course, he sent this telegram to the man who'd been his teacher 6 years earlier. And 15 years after he left Bryn Melyn, soon after his appointment to the Plumian chair at Cambridge, he wrote this letter of commendation of Mr. Landon, who was himself applying for a more responsible teaching post. Landon was a remarkably fine teacher, he said, who succeeded in getting the best work possible out of his boys. In the letters Eddington wrote to Mr. Landon from Manchester, we can see something of his character in his late teens. "I wish I could do better at the mathematics paper than I have done," he writes. "I mean get a better percentage, not necessarily a higher place." He set his goals by an absolute standard of rightness, rather than by mere competitive performance. And in pursuit of his goals, he was willing to be exceedingly meticulous. "I enjoy working in the physical laboratory. I expect to have an examination this term. I've been spending a lot of time on the chemical balance lately. You can spend a lot of time too. It took me exactly 2 hours and 20 minutes to weigh a piece of quartz accurately to the 10th of a milligram. Of course, I really did it twice to test whether it came the same each time." This painstaking pursuit of accuracy was vital later on, in the measurement of the data taken during the eclipse expedition of 1919. The positions of the star images on the photographic plates had to be measured to within a few hundredths of a millimetre. What about Eddington's later work, perhaps his more important work, on epistemology and the philosophy of science? Can we find any hints of this in the records of his early life at Weston-super-Mare? This is harder and more speculative. The philosophy of physical science is one of Eddington's last books, the result of nearly a lifetime of slowly evolving thought. Nevertheless, it's possible that half-conscious recollections of his early life in Weston-super-Mare found their way into that profound integration. Fishing was the local industry. Imagine a curious boy asking a fisherman what he was fishing for.
Mainly shrimps and sprats.
What's this net?
This is a shrimp net.
You mean the sprat net was different?
A sprat is bigger than a shrimp.
Oh, you mean the shrimp would go through the holes in the sprat net?
Yes, that's right. When we go sprat fishing, we don't want a shrimp. After all, the shrimp is not a fish.
Shrimp isn't fish.
The fish you catch depends on the net you use. Eddington's net was superb. His acute powers of observation, his patient and painstaking approach to experimental physics, his profound and far-reaching intellect, and his drive for excellence combined to yield a wealth of positive achievement, for which we rank him as one of the most important physicists of the 20th century and indeed of all time. Towards the end of his life, Eddington moved deep into unknown territory. Intellectually, he left his contemporaries far behind. A few of them worked with him to the best of their ability. Some suspended judgment, and others ignored him altogether. Others attacked him. He continued to press forward. As in his adolescence, he was seeking a higher percentage, not necessarily a better place. What was the 100% he was striving for? It was nothing less than a unified physical theory of the cosmos. How close did he come to that goal? We still don't know enough to judge. But whatever that judgment may finally be, Eddington's achievements are lasting and must be given lasting recognition. 36 years after Eddington's death, this plaque was erected and unveiled on Varzin, his childhood home, pursuant to the theory of primary property of Andrew J. Galambos. The plaque now stands as a public expression of gratitude and a statement of Eddington's importance in the flow stream of cosmological innovation.